Chapter 17, Part 1 of Social Statics by Herbert Spencer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 17, The Rights of Children, Part 1. Section 1. If we are once sure of our law, sure that it is a divine ordination, sure that it is rooted in the nature of things, then whithersoever it leads, we may safely follow. As elsewhere pointed out, Lemma 2, a true rule has no exceptions. When therefore that first principle from which the rights of adults are derived turns out to be a source from which we may derive the rights of children, and when the two processes of deduction prove to be identical, we have no choice but to abide by the result, and to assume that the one inference is equally authoritative with the other. That the law, every man has freedom to do all that he wills, provided he infringes not the equal freedom of any other man, applies as much to the young as to the mature, becomes manifest on referring back to its origin. God wills human happiness. That happiness is attainable only through the medium of faculties. For the production of happiness, those faculties must be exercised. The exercise of them presupposes liberty of action. These are the steps by which we find our way from the divine will to the law of equal freedom. But the demonstration is fully as complete when used on behalf of the child as when used on behalf of the man. The child's happiness, too, is willed by the deity. The child, too, has faculties to be exercised. The child, too, needs scope for the exercise of those faculties. The child, therefore, has claims to freedom, rights, as we call them, coextensive with those of the adult. We cannot avoid this conclusion if we would. Either we must reject the law altogether, or we must include under it both sexes and all ages. The candid thinker will find himself obliged to concede this when he considers the many perplexities which follow in the train of any other theory. For if it be asserted that the law of equal freedom applies only to adults, that is, if it be asserted that men have rights, but that children have none, we are immediately met by the question: when does the child become a man? At what period does the human being pass out of the condition of having no rights into the condition of having rights? None will have the folly to quote the arbitrary dictum of the statute book as an answer. The appeal is to an authority above that of legislative enactments, demands on what these are to be founded, on what attribute of manhood recognition by the law of equal freedom depends. Shall the youth be entitled to the rights of humanity when the pitch of his voice sinks an octave, or when he begins to shave, or when he ceases growing, or when he can lift 100 weight? Are we to adopt the test of age, of stature, of weight, of strength, of virility, or of intelligence? Much may no doubt be said in favor of each of these, but who can select the true one? And who can answer the objection that whichever qualification is chosen will class many as men who are not at present considered such, whilst it will reject from the list others who are now by universal consent included in it? Nor is this all, for even supposing that, by some undiscovered species of logic, it has been determined on what particular day of his life the human being may equitably claim his freedom, it still remains to define the position he holds previously to this period. Has the minor absolutely no rights at all? If so, there is nothing wrong in infanticide. If so, robbery is justifiable, provided the party robbed be under age. If so, a child may equitably be enslaved. For as already shown, murder, theft, and the holding of others in bondage are wrong, simply because they are violations of human rights. And if children have no rights, they cannot become the subjects of these crimes. But if, on the other hand, it be held, as it is held, that children have some rights, if it be held that the youth has an equal claim to life with the adult, if it be held that he has something like the same title to liberty, and if it be held, though not by law, yet by public opinion, that he is similarly capable of owning property, then it becomes needful to show why these primary rights must be conceded, but no others. They who assert that children are wholly without rights, and that, like the inferior animals, they exist only by permission of grown men, take up a precise, unmistakable position. But they who suppose children to occupy a place morally above that of brutes, and yet maintain that whilst children have certain rights, their rights are not equal with those of men, are called upon to draw the line, to explain, to define. They must say what rights are common to children and adults, and why. They must say where the rights of adults exceed those of children, and why. And their answers to these queries must be drawn not from considerations of expediency, but from the original constitution of things. Should it be argued that the relationship in which a parent stands to his child, as supplying it with the necessaries of life, is a different one from that subsisting between man and man, and that consequently the law of equal freedom does not apply, the answer is that though by so maintaining it a parent establishes a certain claim upon his child, a claim which he may fairly expect to have discharged by a like kindness toward himself should he ever need it, yet he establishes no title to dominion. For if the conferring an obligation establishes a title to dominion in this case, then must it do so in others. Whence it will follow that if one man becomes a benefactor to another, he thereby obtains the right to play the master over that other, a conclusion which we do not admit. Moreover, if in virtue of his position a parent may trench upon the liberties of his child, there necessarily arises the question, to what extent may he do this? May he destroy them entirely, as by committing murder? If not, it is required to ascertain the limit up to which he may go, but which he must not exceed. A problem equally insoluble with the similar one just noticed. Unless, therefore, the reader can show that the train of reasoning by which the law of equal freedom is deduced from the divine will does not recognize children, which he cannot, unless he can show exactly at what time the child becomes a man, which he cannot, unless he can show why a certain share of liberty naturally attaches to both childhood and manhood, and another share to only one, which he cannot, he must admit that the rights of the youth and the adult are coextensive. There is indeed one plausible-looking way of meeting these arguments. It may be urged that in the child many of the faculties of the future man are undeveloped, and that as rights are primarily dependent on faculties, the rights of children cannot be coextensive with those of adults, because their faculties are not so. A fatal objection, this, did it touch the question, but it happens to be wholly beside it. The fullest endowment of rights that any being can possess is perfect freedom to exercise all his faculties. And if each of two beings possesses perfect freedom to exercise all his faculties, each possesses complete rights. That is, the rights of the two are equal, no matter whether their faculties are equal or not. For to say that the rights of the one are less than those of the other, because his faculties are fewer, is to say that he has no right to exercise the faculties he has not got. A curious compound of truism and absurdity. Section 2. Due warning was given, page 51, that our first principle carried in it the germs of sundry unlooked-for conclusions. We have now met with one of these. We have just found ourselves committed to a proposition at war with the convictions of almost all. Truth, however, must of necessity be consistent. We have therefore no alternative but to re-examine our preconceived opinions in the expectation of finding them erroneous. That we may enter upon this task in a philosophical spirit, it will be well, at the risk even of something like repetition, to glance at the influences by which our beliefs are in danger of being warped. We need constantly reminding of these. As an abstract truth, we all admit that passion distorts judgment, yet never inquire whether our passions are influencing us. We all decry prejudice, yet are all prejudiced. We see how habits and interests and likings mold the theories of those around us, yet forget that our own theories are similarly molded. Nevertheless, the instances in which our feelings bias us in spite of ourselves are of hourly recurrence. That proprietary passion which a man has for his ideas veils their defects to him as effectually as maternal fondness blinds a mother to the imperfections of her offspring. An author cannot, for the life of him, judge correctly of what he has just written. He has to wait until lapse of time enables him to read it as though it were a stranger's, and he then discerns flaws where all had seemed perfect. It is only when his enthusiasm on its behalf has grown cold that the artist is able to see the faults of his picture. Whilst they are transpiring, we do not perceive the ultimate bearing of our own acts or the acts of others towards us. Only in after years are we able to philosophize upon them. Just so, too, is it with successive generations. Men of the past quite misunderstood the institutions they lived under. They pertinaciously adhered to the most vicious principles and were bitter in their opposition to right ones, at the dictates of their attachments and antipathies. So difficult is it for man to emancipate himself from the invisible fetters which habit and education cast over his intellect, And so palpable is the consequent incompetency of a people to judge rightly of itself and its deeds or opinions, that the fact has been embodied in the current aphorism, "No age can write its own history," an aphorism sufficiently expressive of the universality of prejudice. If we act wisely, we shall assume that the reasonings of modern society are subject to the like disturbing influences. We shall conclude that, even now, as in times gone by, opinion is but the counterpart of condition, merely expresses the degree of civilization to which we have attained. We shall suspect that many of those convictions which seem the results of dispassionate thinking have been nurtured in us by circumstances. We shall confess that as heretofore fanatical opposition to this doctrine and bigoted adhesion to that have been no tests of the truth or falsity of the said doctrines, so neither is the strength of attachment or dislike which a nation now exhibits towards certain principles any proof of their correctness or their fallacy. Nay, more, we shall not only admit that public opinion may be wrong, but that it must be so. Without a general equilibrium between institutions and ideas, society cannot subsist. And hence, if error pervades our institutions, it must similarly pervade our ideas. Just as much as a people falls short of perfection in its state, will it lack of truth in its beliefs. Thus much by way of bespeaking a calm hearing. As lately said, the proposition about to be maintained conflicts with the habits, associations, and most cherished convictions of the great majority. That the law of equal freedom applies to children as much as to adults, that consequently the rights of children are coextensive with those of adults, that as violating those rights, the use of coercion is wrong, and that the relationship now commonly existing between parents and children is therefore a vicious one. These are assertions which perhaps few will listen to with equanimity. Nevertheless, if there be any weight in the foregoing considerations, we shall do well to disregard all protests of feeling, and place implicit faith in the conclusions of abstract equity. Section 3. We say that a man's character may be told by the company he keeps. We might similarly say that the truth of a belief may be judged by the morality with which it is associated. Given a theory universally current amongst the most degraded sections of our race, a theory received only with considerable abatements by civilized nations, a theory in which men's confidence diminishes as fast as society advances, and we may safely pronounce that theory to be a false one. On such, along with other evidence, the subordination of sex was lately condemned. Those commonly observed facts that the enslavement of woman is invariably associated with a low type of social life, and that conversely, her elevation towards an equality with man uniformly accompanies progress, were cited in part proof that the subjection of female to male is essentially wrong. If now, instead of women, we read children, similar facts may be cited, and a similar deduction may be drawn. If it be true that the dominion of man over woman has been oppressive in proportion to the badness of the age or the people, it is also true that parental authority has been stringent and unlimited in a like proportion. If it be a fact that the emancipation of women has kept pace with the emancipation of society, it is likewise a fact that the once despotic rule of the old over the young has been ameliorated at the same rate. And if in our own day we find the fast-spreading recognition of popular rights accompanied by a silently growing perception of the rights of women, we also find it accompanied by a tendency towards systems of non-coercive education, that is, towards a practical admission of the rights of children. Whoever wants illustrations of this alleged harmony between the political, connubial, and filial relationships may discover them anywhere and everywhere. Scanning that aboriginal state of existence during which the aggressive conduct of man to man renders society scarcely possible, he will see not only that wives are slaves and exist by sufferance, but that children hold their lives by the same tenure and are sacrificed to the gods when fathers so will. He may observe how during classic times the thraldom of 5/6 of the population was accompanied both by a theory that the child is the property and slave of its male parent, and by a legal fiction which regarded wives as children similarly owned. That political degradation of the present East Indian races, for whom absolute monarchy seems still the only possible form of rule, he will find accompanied alike by suttees and by infanticide. The same connection of facts will be seen by him in China, where under a government purely autocratic there exists a public opinion which deems it an unpardonable offense for a wife to accuse her husband to the magistrate, and which ranks filial disobedience as a crime next in atrocity to murder. Nor is our own history barren of illustrations. On reviewing those times when constitutional liberty was but a name, when men were denied freedom of speech and belief, when the people's representatives were openly bribed and justice was bought, the times, too, with which the laws enacting the servitude of women were in complete harmony, the observer cannot fail to be struck with the harshness of parental behavior, and the attitude of humble subjection which sons and daughters had to assume. Between the close of the last century, when our domestic condition was marked by the use of sir and madam in addressing parents, and by the doctrine that a child ought unhesitatingly to marry whomsoever a father appointed, and when our political condition was marked by aristocratic supremacy, by the occurrence of church and king riots, and by the persecution of reformers, between that day and ours, the decline in the rigor of paternal authority and in the severity of political oppression has been simultaneous. And, as already remarked, the like companionship of facts is seen in the present rapid growth of democratic feeling and the equally rapid spread of a milder system of juvenile training. Thus, the biography of the race affords ample illustration of the alleged law. That uniformity of moral tone which it was asserted must necessarily pervade a nation's arrangements social, marital, and parental, we see exemplified alike under all phases of civilization. Indeed, this position hardly needed proof, being, as it is, a direct corollary from self-evident truths. As surely as a man's character shines through all his deeds, so surely does the character of a people shine through all its laws and customs. Having a common root in human nature, contemporary institutions cannot fail to be equally affected by the imperfection of that nature. They must all be right or wrong together. The evil which taints one must taint all. The change which reforms one must at the same time reform all. The progress which perfects one must eventually perfect all. Consequently, whoever admits that injustice is still visible in the dealings of class with class, whoever admits that it similarly exhibits itself in the behavior of one sex to the other, cannot but admit that it necessarily exists in the conduct of the old to the young. And he must further admit that being most implicitly received amongst the most barbarous nations, and waning as its influence does with the advance of civilization, the doctrine of filial subjection is entirely condemned by its associations. Section 4. If coercive education be right, it must be productive of good, and if wrong, of evil. By an analysis of its results, therefore, we shall obtain so much evidence for or against the doctrine that the liberties of children are coextensive with those of adults. That coercive education is impolitic may be strongly suspected from the fact lately adverted to, the evident disposition towards the abandonment of it which modern systems of training evince. Considering what universal attention the culture of the young has lately received, the books written about it, the lectures delivered on it, the experiments made to elucidate it, there is reason for concluding that, as the use of brute force for educational purposes has greatly declined, something radically wrong must be involved in it. But without dwelling upon this, which, like all inferences drawn from expediency, is liable to have its premises called in question, let us judge of coercive education not by the effects it is believed to produce, but by those it must produce. Education has for its object the formation of character, to curb restive propensities, to awaken dormant sentiments, to strengthen the perceptions and cultivate the tastes, to encourage this feeling and repress that, so as finally to develop the child into a man of well-proportioned and harmonious nature. This is alike the aim of parent and teacher. Those, therefore, who advocate the use of authority, and if need be, force in the management of children, must do so because they think these the best means of compassing the desired object, formation of character. Paternity has to devise some kind of rule for the nursery. Impelled partly by creed, partly by custom, partly by inclination, paternity decides in favor of a pure despotism, proclaims its word the supreme law, anathematizes disobedience, and exhibits the rod as the final arbiter in all disputes. And of course, this system of discipline is defended as the one best calculated to curb restive propensities, awaken dormant sentiments, etc., etc., as aforesaid. Suppose now we inquire how the plan works. An unamiable little urchin is pursuing his own gratification, regardless of the comfort of others, is perhaps annoyingly vociferous in his play, or is amusing himself by teasing a companion, or is trying to monopolize the toys intended for others in common with himself. Well, some kind of interposition is manifestly called for. Paternity, with knit brows and in a severe tone, commands desistance, visits anything like reluctant submission with a sharp "do as I bid you." If need be, hints at a whipping or the black hole. In short, carries coercion or the threat of coercion far enough to produce obedience. After sundry exhibitions of perverse feeling, the child gives in, showing, however, by its sullenness, the animosity it entertains. Meanwhile, paternity pokes the fire and complacently resumes the newspaper under the impression that all is as it should be. Most unfortunate mistake. If the thing wanted had been the mere repression of noise or the mechanical transfer of a plaything, perhaps no better course could have been pursued. Had it been of no consequence under what impulse the child acted, so long as it fulfilled a given mandate, nothing would remain to be said. But something else was needed. Character was the thing to be changed rather than conduct. It was not the deeds, but the feeling from which the deeds sprung that required dealing with. Here were palpable manifestations of selfishness, an indifference to the wishes of others, a marked desire to tyrannize, an endeavor to engross benefits intended for all. In short, here were exhibitions on a small scale of that unsympathetic nature to which our social evils are mainly attributable. What, then, was the thing wanted? Evidently an alteration in the child's disposition. What was the problem to be solved? Clearly, to generate a state of mind which, had it previously existed, would have prevented the offending actions. What was the final end to be achieved? Unquestionably, the formation of a character which should spontaneously produce greater generosity of conduct. Or, speaking definitely, it was necessary to strengthen that sympathy to the weakness of which this ill behavior was traceable. But sympathy can be strengthened only by exercise. No faculty whatever will grow save by the performance of its special function. A muscle by contraction, the intellect by perceiving and thinking, a moral sentiment by feeling. Sympathy, therefore, can be increased only by exciting sympathetic emotions. A selfish child is to be rendered less selfish only by arousing in it a fellow feeling with the desires of others. If this is not done, nothing is done. Observe, then, how the case stands. A grasping, hard-natured boy is to be humanized, is to have whatever germ of better spirit may be in him developed. And to this end it is proposed to use frowns, threats, and the stick. To stimulate that faculty which originates our regard for the happiness of others, we are told to inflict pain or the fear of pain. The problem is to generate in a child's mind a sympathetic feeling, and the answer is beat it or send it supperless to bed. Thus, we have but to reduce the subjection theory to a definite form to render its absurdity self-evident. Contrasting the means to be employed with the work to be done, we are at once struck with their utter unfitness. Instead of creating a new internal state which shall exhibit itself in better deeds, coercion can manifestly do nothing but forcibly mold externals into a coarse semblance of such a state. In the family, as in society, it can simply restrain. It cannot educate. Just as the recollection of Bridewell and the dread of a policeman, whilst they serve to check the thief's depredations, effect no change in his morals, so, although a father's threats may produce in a child a certain outside conformity with rectitude, they cannot generate any real attachment to it. As someone has well said, the utmost that severity can do is to make hypocrites. It can never make converts. End of Chapter 17, Part 1.